I want to start by welcoming Helen and John and Jeremy to this platform for the first time. They are a great group of three folks who, with colleagues, produce a daily newsletter called International Intrigue. And I'll turn to John Fowler. John, to just explain to people how you started to do this newsletter and how you think it's different in the marketplace from other morning newsletters, at least morning in the US.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Great to be with you. As you mentioned, Helen, Jeremy, and I are all former Australian diplomats. And we identified a need in the market for this kind of international political, geopolitical news and analysis just to be made a ton more accessible. You know, we have this thesis that this stuff hasn't really mattered as much as it matters now since before the Cold War. But it can be pretty confusing, full of jargon, full of very self-serious folks. So we're trying to modernize it and bring it into the 21st century. And the daily newsletter is that's what it does. It takes the global news that we think matters. We rely on our experience, well over 35, 40 years combined experience in diplomacy. We rely on that to choose the stories that matter and explain what we think they mean. And just to pick out one point you said there, Mark, I think it's really important. We try to be apolitical. We want to make this a big tent. If you're from the left or from the right or whatever your political views are, we hope that you'll find our analysis and our news coverage, pretty fair and balanced and even.
Okay. John has mentioned the product. I did too. I do urge you to subscribe. It's a great way to understand what's going on around the world. And because of their experience as diplomats, I think you'll get a sense of the value added there that you don't see in something that's purely journalistic. I want to ask Helen to join us now. And Helen, tell us where you are physically. John, you're in Chicago, correct?
I am, yeah.
Okay. And Helen, you're in Washington?
I am in Washington, D.C. That's right. In the thick of it in D.C. in the capital.
All right. And Helen, when people try to guess at your accent in Washington, what do they normally guess?
South African, surprisingly, and unfortunately, actually.
Okay. We'll come back to that. And finally, that's Jeremy, right, who's in Australia, his native Australia. Jeremy, I'd love for you to unmute yourself if you're muted and just tell us what time it's there and what you have for breakfast. Waiting for Jeremy to join. All right. When Jeremy pops up, we'll hear what he had for breakfast.
The internet hasn't quite gotten down under yet, Mark.
Hi.
They're working on that.
Jeremy,
let me unmute myself. But yeah, can you hear me now? It wouldn't let me.
Oh, yes, we've got you.
All right, Jeremy, what'd you have for breakfast? I'm just trying to highlight the fact that you're in a different part of the universe.
What did I have for breakfast? Mark, I've got 2 young kids. I have not had breakfast. I'm just going on pure coffee straight into my veins.
So, Jeremy, just talk a little bit in terms of the craft of putting the newsletter together. You're plus 14 from New York, is that right?
Yeah.
So how does that work in terms of communicating with your colleagues and publishing early in the morning East Coast time, America East Coast?
Yeah, that's a good question. We had wondered how it would work. The reality is it works great because when folks in the US are asleep and are about to wake up, for me, it's my evening and I'm putting the finishing touches. I've got the latest news, the latest developments, and we're putting the finishing touches together for the newsletter to hit send. So it works out great, although it does involve some early mornings and late nights for the three of us to get together and chat from time to time.
Okay. What I've learned in dealing with you three is Australians are great at acting humble, but in fact are better than everybody else, or at least think they are. That's not passive aggressive, that's just reality. Helen, I want to start with you as we get into our conversation, and I'll remind everybody, we will get to your questions, and when we do, I'd like you to raise your hand, come on camera, and ask them. Helen, something you wrote in the newsletter this morning about a bandwidth crisis, and we've seen this in the United States with President Biden and his national security team engaged in all sorts of things around the world. And you thought, well, Russia, Ukraine is going to be the epic conflict that will dominate their bandwidth. And of course, now the president's been dealing with the Middle East. So talk about what the bandwidth crisis is, not just for the American government, for diplomats and heads of state, heads of government around the world.
Yeah, that's a great question to kick us off, right? I think that, as we've seen generally globally, there's been a trend of governments downsizing their diplomatic corps. I think famously, Australia amongst the OECD countries is one of the smallest per capita. Like, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, John and JD, but we've really struggled to get good people around the world in order to deal with the crises, because a lot of these crises, you still need bodies in the room and for people to be there on the ground. It's not enough to get information from Twitter or X and other sort of online sources. You really need the people-to-people diplomacy, right? The tradecraft. So I think, in recent years, going against that trend of downsizing diplomats and downsizing foreign services, we've seen conflicts sort of spike up around the world. And that's not just in the hot spots that you've mentioned, but it's also in sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel region, which we've written about in Intrigue that we don't talk a lot about otherwise, as well as sort of politically and economically to cover in Latin America. So I think generally, we're seeing a sort of like divergent trends of sort of downsized government with increased geopolitical hotspots that impact all parts of people's lives, like international trade and politics.
Yeah, I'd go even further, Helen. I think it's not just downsized government. It's the idea that in most governments, but certainly in our experience, that the decision makers are where the choke points are, and they've got finite attention and finite, what they care about is finite too. So even if you have a huge diplomatic service or a huge bureaucracy, like I would argue the US has a pretty big foreign service, certainly compared to Australia's, you can have all the decisions ready to go, but that one person who needs to make them doesn't get to them. It kind of all sits there in limbo. So it's the bandwidth problem, I think, is the higher you go up, right?
And also, I mean, having worked on the inside, our job is to try and solve those problems in a way that they don't need to get escalated to the top. But the reality of our world is that the problems seem to be getting more complicated and more vexed, and more of them require some kind of decision from the top. So we've been in that situation where we are one of 10 parts of a foreign service, all trying to get the minister to make a decision on something. And you have to argue amongst yourselves about which decision needs to get pushed to the top of that in tray first. So it's a very literal bureaucratic bandwidth problem that Helen, I think, was describing, as well as a big picture foreign policy bandwidth problem.
I want to ask you another general question before we talk about Ukraine and Russia. I've known Tony Blinken since he was a Capitol Hill staffer, and to watch him go from that anonymous Capitol Hill staffer to Secretary of State's been kind of incredible for me. What's the perception of him around the world? Is he seen as a huge titan of foreign policy and international relations? Is he seen as a non-figure? How do you think diplomats and other leaders of government see him these days?
Well, I could jump in there. I was actually posted to the US as an Australian diplomat during the Trump administration. And so everyone's looking at which way the American people are going to go on election day. And that means having a sense of, okay, if there's a change of government, who's going to be the key people? And it was pretty widely assumed across DC, across the US, across all the foreign embassies that Tony Blinken was going to be Biden's Secretary of State. He's been a known figure for a long time. He was foreign policy advisor to Biden when he was vice president. So people knew him, people liked him in terms of, he would make time, he would listen, he would deal with people fairly. And so I think one way to answer your question, Mark, is that I guess there were no surprises. This was not a sort of maverick left field appointment, sort of, lobbed in out of nowhere into foggy bottom. This was someone that folks knew. And I think from that perspective, foreign governments felt a sense of comfort in the continuity that brings.
I mean, he also speaks foreign languages, which I think is always a plus, right? His French is quite impressive, actually, if you've seen the recent remarks he made at the
Better than Jerry Lewis.
That's right. And I think, Blinken, one thing he's got to work on is his poker face. I don't know if you guys have seen those clips of him responding to President Biden's remarks about China and President Xi, but they're real gold.
His French is really good, and it actually came in handy.
Sorry.
I was going to say, his French is actually really good, and it came in handy when French-US relations were strained by the AUKUS announcement around submarines, which Australia was involved in. The French felt really blindsided by one of their closest, longest allies. And it was pretty impressive to see Tony Blinken in France giving an interview in French. That's something that other countries where English is not the native language, that's something they take for granted. for us in Australia and in other parts of the English-speaking world, that's not so common. So yeah, he's definitely got some assets that Americans should feel proud about.
Yeah, so I've known him for a while. I think he's a very sweet man. And there was a little kerfuffle the other day of a question whether he's tough enough. If you did a focus group of diplomats from around the world and said, what adjectives come to mind when you think of Tony Blinken? What would they be? Would they be hard-headed, tough, ruthless? What do you think people would say about him?
I mean, I think the words that come to my head are kind of competent, bureaucratic, insider, you know, sort of that idea of like a loyal servant to the administration, to the country, that kind of vibe, rather than someone who's going, you know, he's not a guy who's going to walk into a room and bang heads together and create a deal out of nowhere. I think and arguably that's kind of why he was appointed. I think after and in no way to kind of get political, but after the Trump years, I think that Biden administration kind of wanted to bring in someone who was seen as a sure hand, a safe hand on the tiller kind of thing. I think that's what he is.
Saudis or these other strong leaders in the Middle East in particular, or dealing with the Russians, it seems to me maybe what the world and the U.S. needs now is somebody who walks in and kind of intimidates people, and that's not Tony. So is that a problem, or he is what he is and he makes the best of it?
I mean, my view, Helen, you may have a different view of this. My view is that's kind of what happens in the movies. You don't get a ton done by walking into a room and bossing people around. You just end up pissing people off. And in diplomacy, folks hold a grudge for a long time. I don't know what you think about, Helen.
I fully agree. And I think that our collective definition of leadership has changed, right? I think that this style of leadership is really, the world is in dire need of this type of leadership right now. And he builds coalitions, which is a very basic sort of tradecraft 101 of diplomacy. And I think maybe, you know, again, not getting political, but some of his predecessors have not been able to do that. So I think him being a sort of, you know, voice of reason from the US at such a turbulent time, I think, in the world is a good thing.
All right, I think we got you at least one subscriber. Somebody says, I'm really looking forward to reading it each morning to learn more about what is going on globally. So there you go, guys.
Welcome.
One subscription. Again, I urge everybody to subscribe. At least try it out. I think you'll see it's a pretty special product for the time of day it comes out and the way they try to explain things. Let's talk about Ukraine. My sense of facts on the ground, I don't follow it as closely as you all do, is Zelensky is holed up largely. He travels a lot for building support, but when he's in the country, he's holed up in the capital mostly, that it's pretty much of a stalemate, that both sides have lost a lot of folks. And the paradox to me has always been there's only two scenarios where Zelensky won't make a deal to end the war. One is when things are going well, because he wants to keep things going well and consolidate, and when things are going poorly, because he doesn't want to make a deal on bad terms. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but that seems to be reality. So what's your sense, Helen, you first, what's your sense of facts on the ground that maybe people don't understand that are having a bearing on both the course of the war and the chance for peace?
I mean, one thing that I think is probably under-indexed or people are not sort of paying enough attention to is the fact that Russia is actually struggling these days, basically in terms of getting ammunition, right? I don't think that, you know, there's a clear winner in all this, but I don't think the narrative and the sort of point of view of Russia struggling to get ammunitions and the fact that sanctions are working on its military establishment is given enough airtime. So, for example, I think we've seen Russia is now sort of depleting its ammunition production capabilities and needing to resort to, you know, Iran and North Korea and those savory partners to be able to, savory, I mean, I'm sarcastically, just for the record, Australians tend to speak very sarcastically. But the impacts of the sanctions are having a really big push, you know, on Russia. So that's one thing that I think folks, when they're looking at where the war is going, we need to pay more attention to that because that's a good news story. Obviously, that's not the end of it. You know, they're going to resort to other means of getting ammunition. But I do think that recent talks of trying to get more sanctions on the military establishment for Russia is working.
One of the things that was sort of the conventional wisdom that I think was true in the beginning was that the Ukrainian government was united and brave and standing to defend the country, and that Putin was in danger of being toppled. It now seems that Putin's quite secure and that the endemic corruption that Ukraine is famous for is back. Is that reality as you understand it? John?
Well, JD's been predicting the fall of Putin since about February 2022. Why don't you explain yourself, Jeremy?
Any day now, Jeremy. It's going to happen.
Russia has a long history of experiencing regime change at home when it experiences vast military losses abroad. And you've got to take a moment to think about how massive the losses are that it's experienced in Ukraine so far. So the latest figures that you can triangulate across different sources put them at 315,000 killed and injured Russian soldiers in Ukraine in 2 years. To put that in perspective, the Russians lost 50,000 in Afghanistan in 10 years. All right. And to put that in even more perspective, the latest intel reports that the West is releasing show that suggest that Russia lost 50,000, so we're talking killed and casualties, just in this one battle to take Avdiivka. Yeah. All right. So we're talking the equivalent of a decade of losses in trying to occupy Afghanistan in one 4-month battle to take a town that no one heard of. So Russia is absorbing staggering losses. And my view has been that that's unsustainable. And that at some point, the people that he's paying to kill others in Ukraine will start to see that their interests lie in getting rid of Putin at some point.
Do you still think that, JD? Like, has anything over the last couple of years just like made you realize that Putin's more secure than you thought?
He's clearly secure. And his response to the Prigozhin mutiny last year was what I guess everyone thought it would be, which was just to double down. So yes, he's more secure because he's more paranoid, and we've seen some examples of that in the last couple of days. One of the pro-Kremlin bloggers that had been
I saw this.
Writing publicly on Telegram to a couple 100,000 Russians about the staggering losses that Russia was suffering in trying to take this tiny town. He, it appears, has just died, and we can all speculate about how. The very high-crane Russian helicopter pilot who made a high-profile defection to Ukraine last year, he was just assassinated on the streets of Madrid. Then there's Navalny. All of this points to a deep, deep paranoia. And when you've got paranoia in the leader, it's also in everyone around him. All the factions whose livelihoods and lives depend on his good favor start to get paranoid at each other. And it doesn't feel sustainable to me. So I don't know whether it'll be this year or in a few years, but it's hard to see him getting out of this one alive.
Yeah, I agree. But I will say that the war is at an inflection point where I really do think that Western support, whether it's through sort of continuous funding, as well as, obviously the US package for Ukraine currently stored in Congress, is very important. So, that's something that I'm watching to see how quickly things progress this year.
Right. Let me ask you another question about Russia, and then I want to switch to Ukraine and this corruption question. In the beginning of the conflict, I assumed that the French and the Germans would, before too long, say, we need energy, we need, all the things we rely on Russia on. They seem to be still holding pretty firm with some new sanctions coming. So am I right that the French and the Germans have largely still held firm? And if so, why was I wrong? What's happened within their domestic politics to allow them to do that?
I think you're not wrong. I think, which is a roundabout way of saying you're right.
It's an Australian way to say it.
Yeah, it really is. But I also think that no one would have predicted that particularly Germany would have such a quick transition away from being so dependent on Russian gas to, not quite independent, but like energy independent from Russia largely. I mean, they've been helped by a couple of warmer winters than expected, but just politically and in the kind of German mentality of how they see themselves, it's kind of remarkable. I think there's
it's coming.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it's coming at a real cost, though. It's sort of part of this broader German deindustrialization that's happening. Two things at once. Its economy was heavily reliant on exporting stuff to China. And China's economy is slowing down. And at the same time, it was reliant on getting this flow of very cheap energy from Russia, which has been vastly reduced. So it's getting kind of squeezed at both ends, and that's it's feeling the pain, and that's probably going to shape its politics. But yeah, I think everyone probably thought it would come back, that France and Germany would sort of rush back to the negotiating table because it was too hard. It also ties into the debate about its nuclear energy policy. They were, shutting down their nuclear reactors probably right at the time when historically they needed them the most. So it hasn't been easy, but it's still surprised me at how much they've managed to transition.
Yeah, I mean, one point to add there is just that about the China point. It kind of coincides with China also developing their own EVs, right? Electric vehicles and all the things that they used to import from Europe. So that's one big factor that's slowing down that trade relationship too.
The other
Let me
thing to
ask
keep
you
in
one more.
mind is,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that there are a couple of members of the European community that have kind of gone the other way. So we saw Austria, for example, their energy minister last week revealed that Austria has gone from 80-something% reliant on Russian gas to 98% since the war began.
Wow.
And that's despite them having a public strategy to dilute their reliance away from Russia. Similar with Hungary, they've also continue to enjoy the cheap gas. So it's mixed across Europe, but the big players certainly have surprised me.
Okay, two quick questions about Ukraine, and then I want to switch to the Middle East and then get to everybody's questions. I don't think I was wrong about Ukrainian corruption. I think it's covered up by the U.S. and others, because if they acknowledge how much corruption there is, it'd be much harder to justify more foreign aid to Ukraine. So what's going on as far as you know within Ukraine? We've seen some personnel changes. Sometimes those have to do with questions of competence, but I suspect it's mostly corruption. So what's your sense of how much there is and how big a problem that is in keeping the morale of the country up and within the government, as well as being a fierce fighting force?
I mean, well, so I'm no expert on Ukrainian corruption, but my sort of expertise, I served in China for a while, and that's a country that's grappled with serious corruption in a systemic military industrial complex kind of way, which is, at least analogous to Ukraine. And I think you're absolutely right, Mark, but it's not surprising that corruption doesn't just sort of disappear because, something happens overnight. It may get pushed to the sidelines, as you suggest, for reasons that are political and trying to get cash from other countries. But I mean, it's a fundamentally corrupt society when you think about, the interaction between government and business, government and military has been for, arguably since the fall of the wall.
Yeah.
And that's not going to go away overnight. If it was to go away, it would take a concerted effort that we would hear about over many, many years, if not decades, I'd say.
Corruption is to Ukraine as sarcasm is to Australia. Helen,
exactly. It's in our DNA.
I mean, you've got to consider all the funds that are going in for the reconstruction as well. In addition to sort of the fighting the war effort, we've got a separate stream of funding for the reconstruction that I think, there's not a lot of oversight on, certainly. And that's not to say that there's certainly, where there's smoke, there's fire. But I do think that that's something that the international community are not really paying enough attention to right now.
Okay,
the other thing to keep in mind.
Go ahead, Jeremy. Sorry.
I was going to say, the other thing to keep in mind, one interesting way to look at corruption is it exists on paper until the war starts in the military sense of corruption. And then you can see who was actually fulfilling their contracts and doing their job and who wasn't. And the lesson we've learned from that was that the real shocking amount of corruption in the military sector was on the Russian side. I think because most of the generals didn't actually think it was going to happen. So there were, basic bits of equipment that weren't, made as they promised.
I bet that's happening on the Ukrainian side too. I just think that the media is much more likely to point out the, ridiculous Russian stories,
Yeah. One last question about the refugee crisis. Early in the conflict, that was a huge story, and the Polish people extraordinarily generous in taking Ukrainians in. What's the status of the refugee crisis? Are people still fleeing Ukraine? Are people settled in Poland? How big an issue is that now?
I mean, from my sense, people are still leaving Ukraine. I don't know if fleeing is the right word anymore, but I think that for most of these people, they do want to return to Ukraine. So there's not this sort of, surge of people leaving and then thinking that they're going to stay in Poland or Hungary or elsewhere in the EU. But I will say that, they have been, quote unquote, better integrated into sort of their society than, say, compared to the Syrian refugee crisis from 2015-16. So I think that, things for the average person in Ukraine are not good. We had one of our Intrigue readers actually who wrote to us and said that her father has now been called up for conscription and he fought in the Afghanistan war back in the 80s. So it's sort of, the state of things there for the average person is not looking great. I don't know if they're fleeing, but I do think that the refugee crisis is more or less under control. Would you say?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's kind of like if you haven't left now, you've probably made a calculated decision not to. I mean, that's generalizing. Obviously, I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but it's not that flow across a border that it was in the early days.
Yeah.
Right,
What is interesting,
talk.
though,
Go
is
ahead.
actually like Russians leaving Russia as well. I think that's something that's been probably not explored enough as well. But Russia leaving Russia to go into neighboring countries like Georgia. I think there's 500,000 Russians, I think, currently in Georgia, camped out in this tiny country. But that's also an interesting point.
Dubai.
Yeah.
Yes,
All right,
right.
let's switch to a place that does have a refugee crisis, which is Gaza. Facts on the ground there seems like Israel has largely stabilized with little skirmishes, the other borders, the north in particular, that the military offensive grinds on, trying to avoid excessive or game-changing criticism from the U.S. and others, and that there's no governance to speak of in Gaza, and the hostages remain, for the most part, hostages, at least the ones who hopefully are still alive. So what are you looking at in terms of facts on the ground? Gaza, Israel, Israel's other borders. What do you look at every day and wonder where, and look to see where the change is?
I'm personally looking at Rafah, and I think, you know this already, Mark, but I had served in Israel for 3.5 years, and I covered the region from Israel. But I really do think that the Rafah border with Egypt is kind of where one of the sort of key levers for influence will be in terms of determining what comes next. Because now we've got sort of, I think, 1 million people squeezed into Rafah, the southern side of the Gaza Strip. So if you imagine sort of right at the border with Egypt, where only, I think, 250,000 people used to live there, and now it's completely overfilled, 4x, 3x amount of people there. But I do think that Egypt has a critical role, along with Qatar, obviously, in the upcoming negotiations or the ongoing negotiations. JD, you wrote about this last night. I think that was a really great take on Algeria's, UNSC resolution.
Yeah, I mean, folks would have seen that the US vetoed a UN resolution on Tuesday. And I guess the value of that for us as folks who look at this in a geopolitical sense was it was a very vivid illustration of how isolated Israel has come, and by extension, its closest ally, the US. I guess the other thing that comes to mind when I think about this conflict is the political leadership on both sides, the Netanyahu government in Israel and the Hamas political leadership, both based in Qatar and Gaza. The positions that they're telling each other and the world are mutually exclusive. Netanyahu says he's going to keep going until Hamas is gone, and Hamas is saying it's not going to sign a ceasefire until Israel pulls out, or at least that it has a plan towards that end. Those two things can't coexist, and it's hard to see either of the parties softening their stance, which makes me think one possible way out of this will be a change in leadership. That might look like the capture or killing of someone like Sinwar, who's the Hamas leadership in, the Hamas military leader in Gaza, or it might look like Israelis voting Netanyahu out. And I'm not drawing a moral equivalence between either of those two things, but that's something I look at as a possible game-changing way out of what this seems like a never-ending conflict.
Yeah. And I mean, successes there, right? We're thinking about, for Israel at least, Benny Gantz, who was the former prime minister and one point head of the IDF. I had met him before, and I think he is, all things considered, much more reasonable and practical than the current leadership in Israel. And I think he can probably make some compromise and shift the needle there.
Ellen, if you were based there now and were writing one of those famous diplomatic memos back to the Home Office about what's going on with the political standing of Benjamin Netanyahu, what would you say? Americans like to predict, many people I know like to predict, he's done, just the way they predict Trump is done, and he's a survivor. Yeah. So what's your sense of how likely he is to maintain power through the war or after the war?
Yeah, one thing I want to address is firstly Douglas's comment. Thank you, Douglas, for calling him out on that. He was running for PM. He had a party that he wanted to use as his sort of platform into the leadership role. I think, look, I don't think you can underestimate Netanyahu. This is something that everybody has heard before. But there was a really great piece in the New Yorker recently about sort of chronicling the time from Netanyahu's brother dying in sort of the Entebbe incident, And then that being such a formative time in his career and how it sort of formed his worldview, right? And he's proven himself to be able to come back each time. I think he's just become a mastermind in playing the system and playing that game, political game within Israel. And Israeli society is so fractured, probably more fractured than it's ever been because of demographic factors, like the ultra-Orthodox as well as the Israeli Arabs and the sort of growing gap between them and the sort of secular Jewish Israelis. So I think that he is really well positioned to exploit that. Whether or not Israel comes together to be able to sort of push him out depends on who the sort of successor is. And as JD has rightly said, if there's someone like Benny Gantz who can succeed him and people throw their weight around behind him, then this might be Netanyahu's last hurrah. But he's going to do everything he can to stay on power.
There's been a lot written about the Bibi-Biden relationship. I'm super interested in it for a variety of reasons, but I don't think anybody's quite captured it yet. Which one of you can address the famous "Hey man" call and what that means and whether we're due for another one? What's the "Hey man" call?
Yeah, JD, that was you.
So what you're referring to, Mark, is a really interesting snippet out of a book that got released a year or so ago. It was an insider's view on what happened the last time there was a major Israel-Hamas conflict in the first half of 2021. It ran for about a week, and as the civilian casualties and destruction started to pile up, Biden felt like he was at the limit of his comfort with that, and he reportedly picked up the phone, called Bibi, and said, "Hey man, it's over. We're out of runway here. It's done." And so I guess ever since October last year, with that shocking massacre perpetrated by Hamas, and then what everyone knew was coming, which was a big Israeli reaction, a lot of people have been speculating that we're due for some kind of a "Hey man, it's over" call again. And we talked a little bit about that in our most recent newsletter. There are some reasons to say that it could be on its way. And there's a lot of reports that Biden is getting increasingly, his patience with Bibi personally, rather than Israel, is really getting stretched thin. And he described, Bibi's response in Gaza as over the top, for example. But there are also a lot of reasons to think that this is different. This is fundamentally different to what happened in 2021, the reasons for that conflict and the reasons for this conflict. I mean, we're talking about the largest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. This was this shocked Israeli society and Israeli politics to its core, and likewise, the bipartisan political system in the US was shocked to its core. So, where I land is that I can't see that "Hey man, it's coming" call coming anytime soon. But it's a good question.
Yeah, John, the "Hey man" call could be motivated by a disagreement with how Bibi's prosecuting the war. It could come out of concern or outrage over the level of civilian casualties. But there's also a domestic political consideration. President Biden's under enormous pressure from the left of his party to do more. Analyzing that, is there an analog for it that you can look to in terms of this relationship? It's not client, master relationship. I mean, there's the Israelis go quite far in saying we're not beholden to the United States. The United States governments generally go quite far to say Israel's not our client of ours. They're independent, but it's a really complicated relationship historically and right now, and between these two guys with a big history.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think if there is a metaphor, it's kind of rock in a hard place for Biden. He has to appease that left portion of his party who, as you say, the UN Security Council resolution that the US vetoed called for immediate ceasefire. And that's the problem that the US has, is this idea that if they agree to an immediate ceasefire, they can be portrayed by the other side of politics or by, anybody really, as having abandoned the Israeli hostages in Gaza. So there's this, both sides are pushing against him. There's no real good answer other than the hostages all getting released and then a ceasefire. But that, as JD said before, seems, not likely in the near term anyway. Well, I mean, we can hope, but, but I also think that, I think it's pretty well documented that Biden doesn't really like Netanyahu. I think that's fairly well on the record, and that's got to play into it. But I don't know. I honestly don't think until those hostages are all accounted for one way or the other that we're going to see much change in this.
That's Australian understatement, which I guess you're also known for.
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of Biden and Bibi. I got one more question for you all, and then I'm going to go to the group. And again, I see a couple hands up. If you do want to ask a question or make a comment, you can direct it at anybody or just throw it to the group. Please raise your electronic hand and we'll start taking through your question shortly. You mentioned one of you mentioned the Egyptians earlier. I don't think we've had the Saudis brought up. And as everybody here knows, it seems like part of the Hamas and Iranian motivation was to try to disrupt the prospect of an Israeli-Saudi deal. Where are the Saudis? What are their goals here? And how are they trying to bring about their goals in terms of this conflict and the implications on this conflict? Could they make a deal with Israel now, or is that impossible?
I think that's scuttled for at least the next 3 to 5 years. Even if they wanted to, I think optically they wouldn't do it because they're the sort of de facto leader of the Gulf states. So I think, if we're looking at this vector of Hamas, achieving what they wanted to achieve, that aspect I think is definitely being achieved. I think the Saudis, will still continue to have under the table sort of intelligence cooperation with Israel, as they've had many, many years before all of this. But there's no sort of prospect of economic ties, certainly, in the foreseeable future. So, I mean, in some ways, it's very sad because I think the region was headed in one direction and then this sort of everything happened and it's set back peace on both sides, I think, for decades.
Which I think the headline of that is that it's a win for Iran, right? Like this is Iran orchestrating all of this. They've done they've come out of this with a bunch of wins geopolitically. One of them being the idea that Saudis and Israelis will not be getting together anytime soon, but also just that idea of they've kind of managed to bog down Israel in a globally very unpopular war. They've lost a lot of moral and I think economic clout. While Iran largely gets to get away with it unscathed, I think, at the moment.
The other way you can think about it, John and Helen and Mark, is, John, you mentioned the US, particularly Biden, being between a rock and a hard place. A lot of these Middle Eastern governments, you could say the same thing. We're talking in many cases monarchies, for example, where quietly in elite circles, they acknowledge the reality of Israel and feel a sense of inevitability that they are going to formalize what is already happening, which is quiet, under the radar cooperation with Israel. But these are not democratic places, and then they're not democratic places. They're also places with very strong anti-Israel sentiment. And so there was a calculation before October in some of these capitals. They felt like it was at a point where they could normalize relations with Israel and it wouldn't lead to too much instability for them politically at home. But that calculation is now totally changed by the Hamas attacks and Israel's response in Gaza.
Do you two agree with Helen that 3 to 5 years before it could even be on the table again?
I mean, how long's a piece of string? I really don't know.
Exactly.
I think a lot of it. I mean, yeah, I think at least 3 to 5 years would be my short answer.
So Australians are sarcastic, they're prone to understatement, and they're pessimistic. How about that? for overstatement,
realistic, maybe.
All right. I'm going to bring in the group. Roger is going to ask the first question. I love free speech. We love free speech this platform, but if you can, restrict your questions or comments to 3 topics if you can. Israel and Hamas, Ukraine and Russia, and how you can subscribe to International Intrigue. Those would be the 3 topics. Roger.
Yes, Lindsey Graham said on Sunday that he proposed that the United States give Ukraine weapons as a loan rather than to provide it. And he said that Trump approved that concept. Is that something that's going to happen, number one? And my second question is mostly to Mark. If in fact Joe Biden is the last Democratic pro-Israel president, what does that mean electorally for the Democratic Party in terms of its pro-Israel political support and fundraising? Thank you.
Okay, 2 good questions. Thank you. First, just to clarify, are you talking about weapons to Israel or weapons to Ukraine?
No, weapons to the Ukraine.
Yeah, okay.
On one of the talk shows over the weekend, I think it was Meet the Press, Lindsey Graham says, yes, he's now for sending weapons to the Ukraine, but as a loan. And he said that Trump had signed off on it.
Yeah. Folks, any of you have a view of that? And this is general question of the domestic challenge of the U.S. and some of the European countries of how do you sell the populace on more aid to Ukraine at this point?
It's a really good
Yeah,
question, Roger.
yeah.
I saw Lindsey Graham's comments. I mean, he was, I guess, falling in behind comments that Trump had made at a rally. I see it as fundamentally a political move in the sense that he and others are trying to thread the needle, which is that there is bipartisan, broad-based support, the polls show, for backing Ukraine, but there is also skepticism about whether the US should be focusing more on domestic problems, and this sense that maybe allies aren't doing their fair share. So I kind of see Lindsey Graham's comment as a way to kind of thread that needle. In practice, I don't know whether it would make much difference. In practice, if sending those weapons on as a loan agreement rather than as a grant, if it results in Ukraine having the weapons it needs to defend itself and pushing Russia back to its own internationally recognized borders, then the question of whether those loans are ever paid off or whether they're written off by some government in DC in 20 years' time, I think that, it's kind of kicking the can down the road a bit, I guess.
I think the question of the next Democratic president and what their posture is towards Israel, I think it's to be written. There's a pretty broad consensus in this country of support for Israel. What has happened on the left has shocked many people in the Biden administration, including the president himself in this country. And you see some of it in Europe as well. I'm not sure that that's going to dominate the party to such an extent that you won't see another pro-Israel Democratic president. I think that chapter's yet to be written. Bruce Parks, question or comment, please.
A question. I was reading an article this morning by Seymour Hersh, and he was reporting the same thing that Frank Dembo acknowledged in the chat, that 74% of the people in Israel support Benjamin Netanyahu, and the other thing is that I think what he said was, and I think it probably has some merit, is that what Netanyahu is doing at some level is he's telling the rest of the world, and the Arab world in particular, that if you want to attack Israel, take a look at what's happening in Gaza, because that's what we're going to do to you. And I think that's probably accurate. So I'm just want to comment on that to see if you agree or disagree.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Folks, what do you think?
I mean, it's difficult to kind of know what's going on inside Netanyahu's mind. I think it's probably fair to say that there's a ton of people in his cabinet, particularly from the more extreme folks in his cabinet who do have that view. I think early on, I don't have the quote to hand, but there was some element of, when they attack, we're going to wipe them out and show that's what happens when you attack us. I mean, I don't know that that's Netanyahu's view, and obviously I don't think it's a particularly constructive view, but yeah, I don't doubt that that's present in some high echelons in the Israeli government at the moment. As for the support for Bibi, I don't know what those numbers are, and I don't read Cy Hersh that much anymore. But I think Helen made the point earlier. There's, even if it is 74%, if you take that as just kind of a place to have this argument, it's not that the 74% necessarily agree with Bibi Netanyahu. I think he had a huge boost in kind of that nationalistic rally around the flag, support Israel as its right to exist after the Hamas attacks. But you just have to look back at last summer with the judicial protest to show that that's a society that doesn't agree with the other side. It's split. There is a huge divergence of how one half of that country thinks its future should go and the other half.
Anybody else, or next question? All right, Aaron, please.
Great, thank you, Mark, and thank you all for just a fantastic forum. I have a quick question for Jeremy and one for Helen, if that's okay, Mark.
Yes, sir.
So for Jeremy, how do you see this shift in the Ukrainian top military leadership and this conflict over their strategy, which is really sort of a shift to a defensive posture, or a conflict behind that strategy of how offensive, defensive they should be, and also forced regeneration, right? They're sort of stumbling in the last few yards to figure that out. And then how do you see that evolving from the strategy against Russia over the next couple of years? And then a question for Helen, which I've read some of your great writing. I'm wondering, how do you see this shift in sort of power hard politics now in the world, and sort of a return of Hobbes, Metternich, everyone that you read in IR school, and the culture that every country has in this integrated deterrence, sort of elite-driven IR world that probably everyone here has been educated in, and there really isn't a culture of how to do that except coming out of the military. And so there's this kind of gap everywhere where, and I think all parties are sort of struggling with this. How do you see that? And, obviously coming from an Australian perspective, but also just, globally, given your experience. So
Aaron,
once
two
again,
great
thank you
questions.
all three.
Folks, go ahead, take it away.
Thanks, Aaron. Look, on your question to me on the changes in the Ukrainian military leadership, they were telegraphed so far in advance, and they also followed a pretty clear, logical, internally logical series of events. The first being that there was so much anticipation and expectation about Ukraine's counteroffensive that was going to come last summer. And it basically didn't meet those expectations. Out of that frustration and disappointment, there started to be some differences of opinion, some personality clashes privately between President Zelensky and the then head of the Ukrainian forces. That started to spill out into the open when we saw the then head of Ukrainian forces write an article in which he described it, the conflict as reaching a stalemate, which was a real if anyone's going to declare a stalemate, it needs to be the political leadership rather than the military leadership, given the way that shapes morale in forces, in voters, in allies, everything. So that was a bit of an earthquake, and it was done so publicly and apparently without authorization from the president or the president's office. So I kind of feel like once that erupted out of the open, it was inevitable, and that certainly the rumors started that he was going to be removed, and then it happened. That being said, I mean, he was an extremely popular general with the troops, with allies who knew him and had been impressed by the way that he had led the defense and then counteroffense. So there was some question about whether that was going to be politically destabilizing for Zelensky to axe someone who's in many ways a national hero. But I think it was just telegraphed so far in advance and followed such a pretty, internally consistent series of events and responses and counter responses. I don't see it as being a major moment or pivot. Helen, your question?
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it short because I know we're coming up to time actually, but I want to say thank you very much, Aaron, for the question. I'd say that what we've seen in the world in the last 3 or so decades is actually an anomaly, right? This sort of security and prosperity underwritten by the United States. And this is coming from an Australian who's obviously our country's benefited from the US world order. I do think that the world at large is fracturing, but I think that the rate at which it's fracturing is probably overstated sometimes. I think the US still remains very, very central to a lot of how the world works at the multilateral level, at the regional level, and even locally, bilaterally with the US. That said, I think where we need to sort of point our attention to is in a lot of these sort of horizontal areas that we'll all be affected by, which is critical minerals, AI and technology, as well as the global South writ large and China's involvement there. So sitting from Australia's perspective, right, there's a lot of things happening in the Oceania or Pacific region where I don't think there's a lot of even we were thinking about this the other day, my partner and I, about how many Pacific Island sort of specialists there are, analysts in DC. And I think we counted them on 5 fingers, right? But the global South and where China's engagement is going forward is somewhere that the West, hasn't really paid enough attention to, and is something that I think is really interesting in terms of how the world is going to continue to sort of fracture going forward. I hope that answered your question. Feel free to hit me up if you want to chat more about that.
Thank you, Helen. We are going to take a couple more questions. We are going to, as we always do, end in time. And I see a couple hands up, and Douglas Workman will be next. If you've got a question, please raise your electronic hand, get in the queue. We'll see if we can fit everybody in. And I want to just say, because I know some people may need to hop off, I do recommend the newsletter. We'll talk about it again at the end. But before you go, you can see how to sign up for the newsletter in the alert you got if you came through Two-Way and Wide World of News. But one of you quickly tell people, besides Googling International Intrigue, what's the best way to get the newsletter?
John, this is you.
Yeah, internationalintrigue.io is our website, and it's, you know, you stick your email in there, and we start sending you the email every morning. But actually, Mark, probably the easiest way is to Google International Intrigue, because that brings up all of our various things. Google's still top of the pops.
Yeah. Douglas Workman, go ahead.
I signed up when I first saw that. So when I first saw it in the beginning of the chat. Thanks, guys. My question has to do with the United Nations Relief Works Agency, UNRWA. The UN has two refugee organizations, one for the rest of the world and one for Palestinians. The Palestinian definition of a refugee is the only one that, you know, that goes from generation to generation, so that 700,000 refugees in 1948 are now 6 million or whatever the number is right now. Do diplomats actually realize this and say things to, like, you guys are crazy, you got to, you know, you got to like deal with refugees the way the rest of the world does? Or is this just we're just going to make accommodations to Palestinians and let them live in this delusional fantasy that they're going to go.
Douglas, thank you. Folks?
Douglas, I hear you, and that was one of the toughest issues to broach when I was in Israel. I had personally met UNRWA workers who had said to me off the record that they didn't believe that Israel was a country. So, of course, being a sort of budding young diplomat as I was then, I didn't really know how to respond, but I pushed back on their assertions. And I do think that it is a big problem, but it's also a relic of how the broader multilateral system, United Nations Security Council, for example, is ultimately not perfect, right? I think, as JD and John, we've both discussed this, I think a famous Norwegian diplomat said the United Nations is not designed to take us up to heaven, it's designed to prevent us from getting to hell. So I'm not saying that UNRWA is perfect. I do think that it's something that diplomats need to address, and I think we do that behind closed doors. But thank you for your question.
Haley Powers, if you can come on camera, we'd love that. But if not, go ahead, you're unmute and ask your question.
Sorry, I have a barking dog, so I wasn't unmuting myself.
John gets you.
I'm feeling.
One of the things that I have found incredibly interesting in, starting from, I guess, maybe the 2020 or the 2021 attacks on Gaza, there's been quite a change in how the younger generations are getting news, given TikTok and Instagram. They're getting news straight from the ground. And I think we see a lot in this case, the word propaganda gets thrown around, and there seems to be quite a division in terms of people's opinions and where they're getting their news sources from. So I'm just curious if what you think or how you think this this current round of violence is going to or has already changed the way we get news or the way we trust our news sources.
Good question. Who wants to get a PhD and answer that one?
Yeah, I've only got a couple of reflections from thinking about this kind of question myself. The first one specifically on the Israel-Gaza situation is that I know a lot of, particularly the youth in Gaza, are getting news from TikTok, and TikTok has been shown pretty systemically to censor a lot of I don't want to say it's Chinese state sanctioned, because it's not quite as simple as that, but it demotes in its algorithm things that are anti kind of the Chinese government line about the world, and elevates ones that are. And that happened in the early days of the Ukraine war as well, because obviously China is sort of allied, or at least a friend of Russia's. So that's one thing. I think it's a whole new paradigm that we're moving into, that algorithms can, if not censor, at least prevent a lot of people from seeing certain kinds of news that don't align with, whatever that is. And I'm sure, I'm sure people think about it, but it's something that I don't think as societies we've grappled with. And then the second thing is, I think that we're really only starting to understand what a modern society, in Western society or wherever you're from, what not having a monoculture looks like. We don't watch the same TV shows. We don't read the same news. Doesn't mean it's fake, doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just you're more focused on what you care about, on your niche, and you're less likely to take in things from other sources. I'm sure that everyone on this call can kind of identify in their own lives that they probably see less stuff that they disagree with than they used to. I don't know. I don't think we know what that's going to do to conflicts, to politics, but yeah, it's something I think we're just starting to figure out. I don't know if you guys have any other reflections.
Well, it's also one of the motivating drivers for our newsletter, Intrigue, which is
Absolutely.
this sense of there is no shortage of information out there, like people on the ground videoing stuff, videoing people involved. So there's more information than we've ever had before. The trick is knowing what to trust, knowing who to trust, and knowing where to focus. And I guess we're kind of building this newsletter based on the realization that we weren't the only ones that found that to be a problem. We did it professionally as diplomats for Australia, sifting through the junk to find what we really need to know. And we felt like there might be an interest in doing that for everyone, which is why we started Intrigue.
And I will add one more thing there. That's also why we send it as an email, because it's one of the few places on the internet that is not really censorable or algorithmically driven. Like if you sign up for our newsletter, you're getting what we say in your inbox every day, and you may not agree with it, but it's not going to get up-ranked or down-ranked or anything like that, which I think is, that's increasingly rare in our information diets in 2024.
Dan, the most patient person on the call, floor is yours.
And I'm wondering if the reported numbers of civilian deaths always come from the Hamas ministry, or are there other dependent sources?
It's a good
Great
question.
information question, guys. Gal,
JD, you might be best placed to answer this, given you dive into this stuff regularly.
Look, it's a vexed question, and I think we need to acknowledge that whatever figures are coming out of Gaza, no one can really verify them. That said, so the specific number we don't know, but I think the trajectory, people that we know and trust, still working in government, find the trajectory to be plausible. That there have been a pretty shocking number of casualties. The other big question, though, that we all have to acknowledge is that when those authorities in Gaza release the death toll, they make no distinction between combatants and civilians. And one way we can look at what that means is that just this week, a senior Hamas leader estimated that around 6,000 Hamas combatants had been killed so far in Israel's reaction. Israel says it's about 12,000, so double that. US intelligence puts it somewhere between 8 and 12,000. But I guess it's one example of, hopefully everyone can acknowledge that there's a number putting out there that makes no distinction between civilians and combatants. And we have to guess thereafter what the division might be. Hamas says 6,000, Israel says 12,000, and we just don't know. But that's about as much as I can say.
Okay. Thank you for all the great questions. I just want to say a few things. The fourth trait of Australians is they embarrass easily. So you all can avert your eyes as I say some nice things about you. I got a text during the session here. Really appreciate their perspective. They're highly informed and measured. And I think those are two good adjectives to describe you three, but also extremely accessible and conversational. And what you saw here tonight was a good demonstration of the tone and the voice of the newsletter. It is, to me, a pleasure to read, even when it's about sad and scary things around the globe. And these three and their colleagues produce that 5 days a week. I strongly urge you, as I have throughout, to subscribe to the newsletter. It doesn't cost you any money. It just will make you smarter and more informed. And again, hearing from these three every day will make you feel a little bit closer to what's actually going on. So really appreciate you three joining. Anything you guys want to say before we close?
I mean, firstly, thank you everyone for giving up time to come and have a conversation with us. I think, by doing this, we're kind of achieving our goal of making this stuff more accessible and having conversations about it. So I thank you for everyone's time. And Mark, thank you for your time as well.
My pleasure. John Fowler and Helen and Jeremy, really grateful to you. Jeremy, I'm going to shave in about 12 hours. When are you planning to shave? Not today.
He lives in Queensland.
Watch this space. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We'll end a little early just because I don't want to risk start talking about Australian food, which is my passion. Thank you again, John, Helen, and Jeremy. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again here for another episode pretty soon. Good night or good morning.
Thank you. Good night.
Good day.